Hello, and welcome to part 2 of our 2-episode special of China Forum, covering the U.S. China Policy Foundation's panel discussion event, Tigers and Flies, Xi Jinping's Anti-Corruption Campaign. Let's pick up where we left off.
I wanted to say just up front how important the topic is we have to discuss. I think the fact you're here is a recognition of the fact of its importance, and I think this issue is not going away anytime soon. I think this is a long-term protected issue that we'll be talking about at considerable length for a protracted period. Each of the panelists here is an expert on one or another facets of China's domestic economy, society, politics, and so I'm going to ask each of them to just make very brief opening remarks on that aspect of the corruption problem that they think is most significant, and then in answering your questions, they'll weave in other things as appropriate. Next to him is Professor Bruce Dickson, and Bruce is research and teaching focus on politics and the dynamics of politics in China, especially the adaptability of the Chinese Communist Party and the regime it governs. His current research examines the political consequences of economic reform in China, the Chinese Communist Party's evolving strategy for survival, and the changing relationship between state and society based in part on national public opinion surveys. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, Smith Richardson Foundation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And last but not least, on my left, your right, is Dr. Sasha Gong. Sasha is a Harvard-trained scholar, sociologist, author, and former political activist who now heads VOA's China branch. And we were just talking, and I was so pleased to find out the listenership has gone up 22 times under her tutelage. So I thought that was pretty impressive. She's a longtime supporter of free media, and Sasha secretly listened to Voice of America broadcasts as a young woman growing up in China. During China's Cultural Revolution, she took part in the underground protests against the regime. Her activities led to 11 months in solitary confinement. Following release from prison, she went to the university in China and later pursued a PhD in sociology at Harvard University. Before joining VOA, she helped found Radio Free Asia's Cantonese service and ran for a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates in 2009. She has authored several books, including Born American, A Chinese Woman's Dream of Liberty, and The Cultural Revolution Cookbook, both of which include her memories of China.
I want to talk a little bit about kind of the public's reaction to the corruption campaign, and to do so, mention some findings from public opinion surveys that were done on a nationwide basis. First back in 2010, before the campaign began, and the most recent one last year, end of last year, to look at how the public is evaluating things today. And the bottom line that I want to emphasize is that this anti-corruption campaign may be good for Xi Jinping because he gets credit for it and it's a popular campaign, but it may be damaging for the party in the long run. So let me talk about why those two things may coexist. One of the common questions in public opinion surveys is what is the nature of corruption in your community? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it about the same? And in the 2010 survey, people were equally divided between those three things, better, worse, or about the same. In last year when the survey was done, almost 60% of the people thought it was getting better. People were able to see with the less common banquets that local officials were hosting, the more careful use of limos and other use of public funds, they saw tangible proof that the anti-corruption campaign was having an effect. And so this is good for President Xi because he's been the main promoter of the campaign. But it's also bad for the CCP because people have begun to realize exactly how extensive corruption is throughout the party and throughout the government and throughout the military. People always knew that corruption existed, and especially at the local level, but now with the focus on tigers in the campaign, the high-level officials who are implicated, people get a better understanding about exactly how widespread it may be. So back in 2010, less than half of the people in the survey would say that corruption was either somewhat or extensive at the central level, but in 2014, 70% of the people thought the same thing. So a big increase in the percentage of people who saw corruption being a problem at the central level. The local level is not much of a change. They always thought local officials were corrupt. And so there's a slight increase there, but not very extensive. Now you would think with all the attention given to corruption throughout the years that this wouldn't come as a big surprise, but most of the attention was focused on local officials. There were very few high-level people who were targeted, who were punished, whose exploits were broadcast as widely as they have been in the most recent campaign. And so in that sense, people have begun to realize exactly how pervasive this problem is and how well entrenched it is at the top of the system. In terms of what explains the degree of support that people may have for the status quo, for the regime as a whole, the more pervasive you think corruption is, the less support you have, the less trust you have in the existing institutions. We often hear about economic factors, performance legitimacy as a basis for the party's legitimacy, as much as rising prosperity. As much as your own incomes are increasing has an influence on your attitude toward the regime, your perception about corruption has an opposite and equal impact on perceptions of legitimacy. So in terms of public opinion, this campaign is kind of changing attitudes, especially about the central level, in terms of how pervasive it is, and has a larger impact on their general attitudes toward the regime as a whole. A second way that corruption is bad for the CCP comes from the personal experience of people involved in corruption. In the 2014 survey, about 20% of the respondents said that they had personally given a bribe to an official. This is not like given it to doctors or teachers. That would be a different type of activity, but actually given a bribe to an official for some purpose. About 20% of the respondents reported they had done so. Another 28% said they knew a friend or family member who had done so. And so just as corruption is seen as a widespread problem, it's a supply and demand issue, right? So if there's people who are receiving bribes, there's lots of people giving bribes too, either on a large scale like businessmen or a small scale for everyday Chinese. Those who paid bribes also had less support for the regime than people who did not give bribes. So not just the perception that corruption is a problem, your personal experience led you to have less support for the regime than people who did not pay bribes. So this is having, just as it's having a positive impact perhaps for Xi, for the popular support for him as president and head of the party, it's also having a damaging effect on the regime and for the party's reputation in particular. At the beginning of the reform era, party elder Chen Yun was reported to have said that if the party did not fight corruption enough, it would destroy the country, but if it dealt with it too much, it would destroy the party. And here's an example where it may be having this kind of a negative impact on the party just by publicizing how pervasive it is, by punishing the wrongdoers. It has the perhaps unintended but not too surprising consequence that now people realize how bad it is, and it's tarnishing the reputation of the party. But at the same time, it has a lingering effect that the dilemma that Xi faces, as Chris mentioned, the more this is seen as just a vendetta against Xi's potential opposition and not really addressing corruption, the more cynicism it creates and therefore further damaging popular support for the regime. And in terms of what we see as an indicator of success, if they don't make any institutional changes change the incentives for corruption or incentives against corruption, then there's no reason for the people who are engaging in corruption in the past to go back to what they're doing, hoping they're not going to be part of the 3% that gets caught. If you don't change the institutional arrangements, you're not likely to change the behavior. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Sasha.
Thank you. It's very enlightening. Well, media and corruption is a very big subject, I have to say, and it should include like media, corruption in the media, or media's role in anti-corruption campaign, or how the media report corruption. And each of them is big enough to be a book subject, so I'm just trying to summarize a little bit. To say that, I would like to start from a very long, some small incident, long memory, long time ago. When Bo Xilai was in Peking University History Department, we studied together. And one day we talked about what we want to do in the future. I said, I wanted to be a professor. That turned out to be wrong. And he said, my dream was to be a reporter of the Xinhua News Agency stationing abroad. And that was his dream, and well, he never did that before, but that's why he went to the Media Institute in Beijing. What I want to say from this example is that working for the media, especially working for the central media, is a very, very privileged job. They are part of the power structure, and they are a very important part of power structure, and media is, after all, the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. So when it comes to corruption and media is interlinked in many ways. So I remember I think last July, and one day, the CCTV, one of the most popular CCTV programs, when it went on air, and it was a co-anchor program. One anchor disappeared. It was a 36-year-old male anchor, Rui Chenggang. He disappeared. And his co-anchor did not even explain what happened. It's just the guy never exists. And the guy turned out to be arrested. And at the same time, I think two female anchors and several producers and directorate level producers were also arrested in CCTV. Very soon, the news turned out to be all those, the leaders in the CCTV and the anchors, those female anchors especially, were mistresses of the high-ranking corrupted officials, especially Zhou Yongkang. When you look at China, look at the corruption report, you often see when you go to local level, city, provincial, you often see that the female anchors of the local stations were somehow linked or have relationships with the corrupted official. It has become very big news in China, and it indicates, as people say, corruption in the media. Of course, this is the most sensational part. The less sensational part, but also very known practice, was, well, we are not talking about, we talk about using public office, as Professor Huang said, public office for personal gain, and all the party leaders were doing that. But if you think enterprises, and they pay media to get better report or to uncover some good report or to suppress some bad report. Several Chinese reporters wrote in their personal blog, they said, well, when there was a big disaster happen, the first thing, when the reporters got there, the first thing they got is a little red bag with cash in it, which means please don't report, or please report it in sort of gives us some good word. So corruption in media is very, very prevalent and very profound. And that's just a very known fact. And the reason for that is media is part of the government entity. If the government is corrupt, the media is as well. And I quickly wrap it up. In the recent years, when the anti-corruption campaign started, we also saw the media report of corruption in the media grow very rapidly. You see every day media report about corruption here, corruption there, but the whole undertone was still the great party, the party did this, the party is cleaning itself. That's one part you see. But within all the media, when we expand the meaning of media, you also see what the Chinese call self-media. The bloggers, the tweets, and that media, that is the media grow very rapidly. That media actually is taking on the role of the traditional media in our sense, the media sense. So lots of corruption cases were exposed by the self-media before they were reported. And several very prominent figures, party figures, were actually dragged down, what they say, by the self-media. So what you see in China is the parallel. On the one hand, you see the state media is still very, very controlled by the government, is still serving as the mouthpiece of the government. On the other hand, you see a new media. The new media grow very fast and serve as the traditional media role in the sense of Western democracy. So from that, I see some hope in China.
We have any takers?
I guess since he's my colleague at GW, I need to respond. People have been predicting the downfall of the Communist Party since the beginning of the post-Mao period, maybe before. And yet it still is in power. It doesn't face an obvious organized opposition. It's got a number of challenges in front of it, but has dealt with challenging issues in the past. Despite the frustration with corruption, with the environment, with a variety of things, people tend to be optimistic about the future, expect their incomes to continue rising. Now, that may create rising expectations the party can't meet, but for now at least, they've been doing a pretty good job keeping people, in a material sense, keeping people satisfied. I think the party's been more adaptable than people often give it credit for. It's not always the most nimble of organizations, but like any other huge organization, it's slow to change, but when it does change, it addresses problems well enough to remain in power. And so I don't see any particular change coming about as a consequence of the economic slowdown. I think the party's done a pretty good job getting people ready to expect a slowdown. What's come about has not been terribly surprising. It's been a slow, gradual decline, not a bursting of a bubble. So I think for a variety of reasons, the party is in a reasonable good chance, a good place to survive. Like I said, it has challenges, but has met challenges in the past.
I might just add a couple things, but I would subscribe to what was just said, so I won't repeat all of that. I think we have to be modest what we know about economic and political developments in China, and that just speaking for myself, but I think many of my colleagues feel we've not been this uncertain about the fundamental dynamics and direction of China, certainly since 1989, and I would go back a couple of decades before that. So I think we have to be very modest about what we know and don't know and making predictions. But my instinct is very much what Professor Dickson said. So then you ask, why are we in this mode? Why do you get such varied predictions? And I think it stems from a very simple set of facts. And that fact is that reform since '77 has changed China. It's a much more pluralistic society. It's much bigger bureaucracy, a pluralized bureaucracy, a pluralized society. And also, society itself has been empowered in very important ways. Money, and transferring money both internally, externally, investing in it, sort of, we'll say non-governmental groups, realizing that's a complicated concept in China. Information that Sasha was talking about. So what we have is a much more divided, complex bureaucracy in society, and we have a much more empowered society. And so the question is this new society going to accept a strongman definition of leadership? And we don't know the answer to that question. China's middle class, however you want to define it, is probably 350 million people. I mean, that's bigger than the United States. And we have certain expectations about a middle class, but those haven't been entirely borne out, at least thus far. So I would say, while I don't agree with the broad character of the article you mentioned, you're hearing very different predictions precisely because this is such an uncertain condition that we, at least on the outside, and I think many Chinese I talk to are equally uncertain.
First, I just want to comment on the previous discussion real quickly first. In that, and rather than, I think both points that were made are very good ones with regard to how to think about it, but I also would just submit that I think that one of the reasons we're seeing more of these kind of coming collapse voices, if you will, is that the group of people who are arguing these points seem to have what, from my perspective, is a bit of a distorted analytic lens through which they're looking at the problem. So in many ways, I think there's a school of thought that it existed for some time, especially under Hu Jintao's leadership, that China was going to move toward greater institutionalization and, a lot of these things. Xi Jinping is an inconvenient truth for, for, that school of thinking in the system. And the other is that there seems to be an undertone of anger in these articles. Anger at the party for, in my mind, being itself. They are an authoritarian regime, and they behave like one. So it's not surprising that they haven't gone toward this opening and so on that these analysts seem to think they should have. And I think that skews their analysis. On the PLA corruption campaign, it is very different, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, Xi Jinping kind of has explained to everyone why it's different. If you go back to the first speech that he made when he did his first domestic inspection tour in Guangdong, or the speech he reportedly made, although I think it's pretty solid that he did indeed make it. One of the things he focused on was corruption in the Soviet armed forces and how the security services and the military had become lax, right? And I think it's easy for us as China modernizes and becomes, people focus more and more on China as China, the country. They also tend to think about the Chinese military as the country's military. It's not. It's the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. And their number one job is keeping the Communist Party in power and preventing a Ceausescu scenario, these sort of things. That's the PLA's number one job, as demonstrated in 1989. And so if you look at what's happened in the corruption space, especially the case of Xu Caiho, right, but there are many others, what you had in effect was a guy in charge of PLA personnel and a lot of the media has focused on the fact that he had a metric ton of cash in his basement and so on. That's a very, flashy achievement, and so it's easy for people to focus on that. But the real story is this notion that you had a guy running military personnel for 8 years who was in effect building a private army inside the armed wing of the Communist Party. These people were loyal to him, not to the party secretary. And I think sometimes it's helpful to think of the party from its Leninist point of view as a religion. And Xi Jinping is the chief priest of the religion. And so if you look at this situation where these guys who are supposed to defend you are corrupt and not reliable, that's a big problem. And I think the leadership saw this when they looked at the Egypt scenario and saw how quickly the military in Egypt turned on Mubarak, and they started to ask themselves, if we had to do 1989 over again, would these guys be responsive? And I think Xi Jinping, because of his background, having had actually something akin to military experience, the most among his colleagues, is very sensitive to that issue, and especially, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, how he sees himself as the savior of the party and so on. This is a key element, and so I would expect this to continue.
Would you agree, too, they're just simply afraid about what the fighting ability of the military in its simplest terms is.
Sure. No, I mean, it's been, it's sort of like what Dr. Huang was saying in his remarks. There's been this weird, because most militaries that are as corrupt as the PLA appears to be don't have any fighting capacity, and yet the PLA seemed to straddle that line. They were doing real training, real exercises, improving their combat capability and so on. But I think, from early on when Xi Jinping was making comments like the PLA needs to be able to fight and win wars, this is the topic he was getting at.
Yeah. Yukon, did I detect you had a response?
No, not to this particular question, but since we're almost finishing here, let me
Yeah.
just make two observations. One is that from an economics perspective, if China's system collapses, it won't be because of the economic slowdown. It's going to be other factors, so I don't think that's the issue. The second point I would make is that there's always discussion about political liberalization, and they usually point to the Arab Spring or they look at Indonesia. And I think that's a mistake. If you're going to look at what's going to happen in China, look for rapidly growing economies with authoritarian regimes and ask what happened. Because that's China. These other regimes doing poorly, high unemployment, all sorts of problems that collapsed. But look for successful developing countries with authoritarian regimes, and then you find, of course, there aren't very many. But there is two in the region, South Korea and Taiwan economy. And I think the interesting thing is that they began political liberalization in exactly the same year, 1987, at exactly the same per capita income level, at exactly the same urbanization and service development. Now, I cite those factors because it creates an eco-political system that generates some of these kinds of forces, and the evolution of political liberalization is internal to the party itself, which of course is what the Communist Party has set. So I think we're actually looking quite often at the wrong kinds of possibilities to look at what's going to happen in China.
So you see China following the path, or at least it's arguably true, that it's following the path of Taiwan and South Korea, and we're just not quite there? Is that?
No, I think we have to ask the question, what are the parameters of China? This is not as I say, other countries with corruption, growth is stalled. People don't have jobs, so you have foment something, right? This is not that. This corruption actually feeds into more growth.
I want to thank everybody, thank the U.S. China Policy Foundation for sponsoring this, and maybe leave you just with a question that comes out of an observation that Yukon just made. The third plenum had the key phrase, make the market the decisive allocator of resources. And I suppose that raises the question, if the market is the decisive allocator, then there's an implication for the Chinese Communist Party, because in the end, the Chinese Communist Party has been the decisive allocator of resources. And so, in some sense, in moving towards the agenda they've already identified, has buried within it, I think, fundamental, certainly political tensions and probably political change. But anyway, just a thought, have a good evening, and thank you so much.
This concludes part 2 of our 2-episode special. I'm Emily O'Brien. See you next time on China Forum.